Well, hello, everyone. It's good to have you here. Welcome to this Dean's discussion on helping the media to strengthen democracy. This discussion is the first of 3 this semester on pressing policy issues. The following 2 discussions will be about restoring health and economic growth in developing countries, and then about achieving a more peaceful world. So I hope that you will come back for those as well. Bring your friends. Today's discussion will be kicked off by 4 members of the Harvard Kennedy School faculty, and I'm very grateful to each of them for agreeing to be with us today. I'll give very brief introductions, and then we'll get started. Matt Down is the Marvin Kalb Professor of Global Communications. His research addresses a range of issues in communications, including the role of the mass media and public opinion in contemporary American politics. Joan, I'm just going in alphabetical order. Joan Donovan is an adjunct lecturer and the research director of our Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy. She leads the Technology and Social Change Project, which explores how media manipulation can affect the public conversation, derail democracy, and disrupt society, in her words. Nancy Gibbs is the director of the Shorenstein Center and the visiting Edward R. Murrow Professor of the Practice of Press, Politics, and Public Policy. She was previously editor-in-chief of Time Magazine, covered politics extensively before becoming editor. So she's been an important participant at exactly the topic that we're covering today. Tom Patterson is the Bradley Professor of Government and the Press. He's written a number of books and many papers about the media's role in politics and the importance of what he has called knowledge-based journalism. We are also fortunate today that Sarah Wald, who is my chief of staff and an adjunct lecturer at the Kennedy School and at Harvard Law School, will moderate today's discussion. So you know this session is being recorded, so other people who couldn't be here at this time can listen to it later. And with that, let me just turn this over to Sarah. Sarah, thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to use the format that we normally use for Dean's discussions, which is each of our panelists will talk for a very brief amount of time to help us set the stage with their expertise and their observations, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. You'll please use the raise hand icon and we'll call on you after the panelists have given their presentations. So very much looking forward to this panel today. When we talked about some of this, we veered a little bit away from the how media can strengthen democracy to talk about all the ways in which it actually has not been strengthening democracies. So that's an important part of the discussion too. And we're going to start out with Nancy Gibbs talking about the structure of the media and how current business models in some ways skew everything in this area. Nancy.
Thanks, Sarah. Typical journalist, I'll start with a challenge to the prompt, which is, why is it the media's job to strengthen democracy any more than the auto industries or the pharmaceutical industries or my corner deli? Media is projected to be a $2.1 trillion global business this year, if you include entertainment. And so that's the start of my answer, is that unfortunately, some of that success comes directly and also indirectly at democracy's expense. And so that's where I start. Unlike General Motors or my corner deli, media is the only industry that is explicitly protected in the Constitution, which suggests it is meant to have some public purpose. But there has always been a tension between purpose and profit. What does that mean? Well, when I was running a newsroom, I was responsible to my publisher, to shareholders, to be financially successful. I was responsible to the public to cover events that mattered and shape the national conversation, as we say. So stories about the royals were cheap to do and highly profitable, as we've all been reminded this past week. Covering a civil war in Yemen, not so much. It is dangerous to send reporters there. It is hugely expensive. Advertisers don't want to be anywhere near that content. And too often readers didn't really care that much either. And that tension over fulfilling a public duty, holding the powerful to account, all got much harder after readers moved from print to their phones and their computers. And Facebook and Google began to capture 2/3 of all digital ad revenue. So just to give you an idea of that, YouTube makes $28,000 a minute just from advertising. They are just better and cheaper at giving advertisers eyeballs and leveraging your data at the expense of privacy. So now newsrooms had to chase after scale, which meant doing more stories faster and certainly more about the royals. And so that's the first thing that has not been great for democracy. Lots of newspapers just died, or they might as well have. The San Jose Mercury News, for instance, employed 440 people in its newsroom in the 90s. By 2018, when it was controlled by a hedge fund, that headcount was 39. 440 reporters down to 39. And nearly half of our counties in this country either have no newspaper at all, or no local news source, or just one. That too, lots of research has shown that has been terrible for democracy. And the newsrooms that have survived have increasingly turned to their readers for revenue, which means they put up paywalls so that more and more good, reliable information costs money, while toxic disinformation available everywhere and it's free. That's really bad for democracy. So the more that newsrooms and networks depended on a loyal, engaged audience that would keep coming back, the greater the temptation to affirm instead of inform. Fox News has a loyal audience, the New York Times has a loyal audience, and increasingly they can't afford to alienate them. So there goes the broad public square where people encounter diverse views. Just to give you an idea of what that looks like, Donald Trump's speech at CPAC 2 Sundays ago had more TV viewers than the Golden Globes. That mass public square has been chopped up into ever and ever smaller and smaller pieces. And finally, as Joan explains better than anyone, the internet was not designed for truth. I entered journalism 1,000 years ago as a fact checker, one of more than a dozen people who had our hands on every single story, writers and editors and copy editors and fact checkers, to make sure that anything that we were publishing was buttoned down and true. Facebook is really good at telling if something is interesting because of how many people like it and share it. But that doesn't mean they can tell if it's true, or even that they care if it's true. And in fact, the research has found that false does a whole lot better than true. MIT did their massive study of 10 years worth of Twitter that found that a false story reaches 1,500 people 6 times faster on average than a true story does. And fake political news of the kind we all care a lot about does the best of all. All of which is to say, even before 2020 and the year of the big lie and the collapse of the business model for journalism had opened up the doors to both the political polarization and the explosion of disinformation that reached peak danger on January 6th. And if we don't address that piece of the puzzle of creating a healthy information ecosystem that serves the public interest, then it's going to be much harder for us to solve all the other problems that people at this school are working hard on every day.
Okay, I think we will just keep going with the presentations because there's a lot of intersecting information here, a lot of overlap, and then we'll see if anybody on the panel has comments back and forth. But let's go to Joan Donovan, who's going to talk about a little bit more deeply Nancy's point that the social media was actually never built for truth in the first place and isn't set up to do what media used to be. Joan.
So thank you so much to the dean and Sarah and everybody for organizing this and inviting me in. I just am so flattered to see some of my students in the room and some of the people that I've yet to meet, but I've read all your work. But also, how do you follow Nancy Gibbs, right? So I'm just going to try here. I do a lot of research of the ways in which people think about technology in order to gain any kind of strategic advantage, whether it's a marketer or a politician or foreign influence operation or a couple of teenage hackers. One of the things that we've learned over the last decade, at least, of social media is that everything open will be exploited. And that means that the social media companies never really understood 10 years ago what they were building. They were like, we're going to connect people. We're going to put people's social networks online. And as scholars of the internet 10 years ago, anthropologists were wary. They were like, well, you can't connect everybody in the same way because people have different customs and habits and localization matters. And these tech companies were like, no, 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 we got it. We're going to build this thing. This whole move fast and break things ethic, and essentially, moving people's social networks into the same place like Friendster and MySpace used to. I know I sound old now, but those were the technologies of my time. Really were about connecting people that are already connected and then having a little bit of extra features on top of it so that you could reach out across your friends' networks, but not really too far away. Over time, when Facebook decided that they were going to register anybody with a .edu and provide a kind of connection service that in some respects was built rather misogynistically, in the sense that it was essentially a place to go and look at women at that time actually was at Harvard, but we won't hold it against us. But that wasn't the purpose of the technology as it evolved. Eventually, social media finds its users in social movements because social movements are incredibly agile and they're frankly fairly agnostic to technology. If it works, they'll use it, right? And so we've seen over the years social movements pick up ham radios, they pick up the telephone, they use, they just use things that are at their disposal in order to build campaigns. But that was an aha moment for Facebook and Twitter, who were like, oh, wait, we support social movements. We are the place for the liberation of people and democracy. And YouTube, sitting over here, YouTube was like DVD dating gone digital, right? It was like video cassettes. You might not know this about our past technology, but the way in which Tinder would work is you'd sign up with a company, they'd mail you VHS tapes, and you'd say, well, I think she's cool, or I think he's cool. And they'd connect you, and maybe you'd start writing letters to one another. But YouTube was an online dating site, and you were supposed to upload a video of yourself and say, hey, I'm interested, right? And so these companies weren't purpose built for, not even just the big T truth, but timely, local, relevant, and accurate information. And as they realized that they needed a business plan because the VC funding was running out, they switched to social media. Early versions of Facebook, you can't put a hyperlink in your status update, right? You can't upload pictures. On Twitter, it's 140 characters and not much else. They integrate pictures later. And I say this to you so that you can think about how technology design evolves with our political and our social conditions in our culture, which is to say that fast forwarding to the moment that we're in, up until from 2016 to 2020, every social media platform was designed for one user in mind, which was, if I do something and it's public and noticeable, will, the current political administration get mad at me? And how many users is that going to cost me? And we saw this in Trump doing a social media summit where he brought in a lot of mid-tier influencers and basically said he's going to protect them. And so what we saw was this ongoing proliferation of disinformation and exploitation of our media environment and our scale without any policy options, without any idea about what technology could and should do to support democracy, to support journalism. And there was a ton of money involved, not just in spinning up disinformation operations and pretending to be local news and throwing pink slime all over the place, but also in changing our politics in many ways for the disastrous, especially when we saw January 6th. And right now, though, one of the very first iterations of technological change that we've seen post January 6th is that Facebook decided that they were going to limit their political group recommendations. And that, to me, as a sociologist, is a really good sign in the sense that now these companies are realizing that our political conditions actually change our technology. Our technology doesn't determine our politics. And we have to be open to that moment. And especially students that are listening, it's our charge actually to figure out what policy options are achievable, what the potential downsides are those going to be. We have to understand, and I'm borrowing a phrase here from my friends over at Belfer and Laura Manley, but we have to understand its public purpose again. And so this is the charge for tech policy in the next several years, is that we do it here and we do it together. Because I think that that's going to be the only way we're going to save democracy. It's going to be the only way we save journalism. And it's going to be the only way we defend society. I went over my 5 minutes, but I love you all.
Okay. Next, we're going to hear from Tom Patterson, who's going to extend this a little bit further and talk somewhat about the dilemmas that this sets up for serious journalists and for some of the mainstream media that we might be counting on to be helping us strengthen democracy. Tom?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So I want to talk about the challenge that journalists face in covering officials who lie. Now, in the period before Watergate in Vietnam, the unwritten rule of reporting was that journalists would report what a newsmaker said, whether it was true or not. And with the notable exception of the McCarthy era, the rule worked pretty well. Officials rarely lied outright. Now, journalists abandoned that rule after the lying that occurred at the highest levels during Vietnam and Watergate. And to counter lying, they dusted off an old, but until then, seldom used technique. He said, she said journalism. When a newsmaker said something questionable, reporters would find an opponent to do the dirty work of putting it down. You go shopping is how LA Times reporter Jack Nelson described it. And it had an added benefit. It allowed journalists to pack more conflict into their news stories, and that heightened audience interest. And it quickly became routine practice, even for stories where truth wasn't at issue. And it protected journalists from the charge of bias. Although they were the ones orchestrating the conflict, the words being heard were those of the newsmaker. And as long as the newsmakers were accurately quoted, journalists could say their reporting was truthful. Now, that practice was obviously a bit of a shell game, but it worked until lying and disinformation became an everyday part of our politics. He said, she said reporting breaks down when one side is lying and the other is not. False equivalencies is how the Atlantic James Fellows describes that. That problem, I think, came to a head after the election with the dueling narratives of a free and fair election versus a stolen election. This to me is really dangerous territory for journalists, and I don't see a way for them to navigate it successfully. If they rely on he said, she said reporting, they become a megaphone for misinformation. Although we typically blame the information problem on social media, partisan media, the Russians, a Columbia University study found that traditional news outlets are a huge part of it, the result of passing along to their audiences dubious claims and outright lies. The alternative is for the journalists to call a lie, and that appears to be the direction they're heading, but it's putting them on a collision course with the Republican Party. It was apparent in a study that I did of 2020 election coverage. CBS's coverage was even more one-sided in Biden's favor than Fox's coverage was one-sided in Trump's favor. In calling out Republican lies, journalists are increasingly being accused by Republicans of having a partisan bias. It's also lowered their trust among Republicans, who increasingly believe that it's the journalists who are doing the lying. A poll last week found that 2/3 of Republicans still believe that the election was stolen. Another recent poll found that Republicans are abandoning traditional media at an accelerated pace, believing them to be untrustworthy and biased. That's a troubling development. If our partisan tribes separate themselves into opposing media systems, polarization will deepen, as will our misinformation crisis. Journalists have been in difficult situations in the past, found ways to walk themselves out of it, but I'm not convinced they have a safe path this time. I think Matt's up, Sarah.
Yes, I look forward to both the audience and panelists suggesting ways we can move forward as we go in our discussion. Matt's going to switch our perspective just a little bit. We've been talking about the journalist dilemma and the flaws of the platforms and the systems. He's going to talk a bit about the demand side. What is it that people are looking for in news, and how can we affect the situation that way? Matt?
Thank you very much, Sarah. So the irony is that I was pretty sure that I was going to be the big downer of this talk, but now I actually think it's going to be the opposite, because I'm actually going to close with something that kind of fits the agenda of today's topic. But I'm going to get there by sort of piling on, but in a different way, as Sarah said. So we focused so far mostly, understandably, given the nature of this session, on the supply side of news and information in the media, pretty much as if the news more or less happens to people, and then they somehow respond to it, and that may be to the benefit or the detriment of democracy. But I think to fully understand, the way or the role that the media play in democracy, for better or worse, the possibility for it to fulfill anything like the idealized role that we ascribe to it, it's important to recognize that people do have agency in this interaction. They always have. Arguably, they have more than they ever have before. And so also to think about the demand side. What do citizens want from the media? Why do they want that? What are they or are they not likely to choose to expose themselves to or to find persuasive? And I think starting there, one thing I think we really do know from decades of research is that given the opportunity, people prefer news and information that it's pleasant to consume. And there are some pretty clear consequences of this. Two of them. One, sort of in the same way that sweets trump vegetables, more entertaining information typically trumps less entertaining information. And a second one is because it's just icky to be told that you're wrong and then have to figure out what to do with that. Information that tells you that you're right is typically going to trump information that tells you that you're wrong. And the more strongly held your beliefs, the more likely you are to seek information that does not tell you that you're wrong. Obviously, I think, self-evidently, the fragmentation of the media, all the stuff that we've really been talking about, has enhanced people's opportunities to act on that second preference, but not necessarily altering it. It's sort of been there all along. It's not a new preference. So between the seemingly limitless variety of news sources out there and the increasingly sophisticated customization algorithms that try to figure out who and what you like, who you are and what you like, and then spoon feed that to you, is just much more likely than it used to be that typical people are going to find themselves with opportunities to expose themselves to news and information that reinforces rather than challenges their prior beliefs, even if they aren't necessarily self-consciously setting out to do that. It also means that because misinformation is by definition not tethered to the confines of frequently boring reality, it has an unfair advantage over the truth. And it tends to be more entertaining, intentionally so. I mean, how can mundane reality compete against a narrative like QAnon, that a cabal of Satan-worshiping, child-molesting, deep state leftist bureaucrats are running a massive child sex slavery ring? I mean, that's better than fictional television. You might hope or think that credible experts could break through the fog of titillating conspiracies and falsehoods and show people that QAnon is silly, that the election wasn't stolen, that vaccines aren't secretly implanting new DNA into your bodies, and on and on. But unfortunately, this is all taking place at a time when public trust in democratic institutions, including the media, are at all-time lows, while reliance on our tribal identities in determining which elites and experts that we should listen to are at all-time highs. So it's not so much that people aren't aware of the expert arguments regarding why all the bad information isn't reliable or good for you. It's that they simply don't trust the messengers to have their interests at heart, and they'd rather listen to sympathetic messengers who tell them that they're right. So one consequence of this low trust is that even if the national news media solved the dilemmas that Tom is talking about, suddenly became adequately resourced and did, perfectly fulfilled its sort of democratic ideal for the founders, for a lot of people, it would have at best a limited effect because they'd be unlikely to pay attention, and they'd be likely to dismiss it as unreliable if they didn't. If they did manage, for whatever reason, to attend to it and found something that they encountered that was inconsistent with their prior beliefs. So while reforms that mitigate the flow of misinformation, improve the quality of national news or international news are certainly valuable and would doubtless be good things, it's important to be realistic about what they can and can't do for democracy. There are no silver bullets here. But as I promised, I want to end on a positive note because I think all that said, it does remain the case that the single best predictor of trust in a public institution is proximity to the individual. I've seen this in the polling that some colleagues and I have been doing for the past year around COVID, again and again and again. People trust their local institutions more than state institutions, and they trust state institutions more than national ones, by a lot. And that holds true for the media too. And so I think one paradoxical trend in recent years is that local news, which is significantly more highly trusted than national news, has been decimated by the changing media environment at a time when trust in big institutional media has completely collapsed and fragmented. So it seems to me that one of the most useful things we could do as a nation to begin rebuilding trust in democratic institutions, including the media, and in doing that, shore up confidence in democracy, would be to invest substantial resources into rebuilding local and even hyperlocal news so that people learn about their local, county, and state institutions from folks that are part of their own communities rather than from distant national institutions that they're just not going to get back to fully trusting. Again, it's not a silver bullet. You can't save everybody. Hardcore partisans are unlikely to be moved even by community-based arguments unless they support what those folks already believe. But most people even today are not hardcore partisans. And so I think doing this could have lots of benefits, ranging from better informing citizens to enhancing trust in institutions. And yes, it could be a way for the media to enhance democracy. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Right, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. And I just want to remind everybody that a good question at the Kennedy School is brief, is addressed to one of our panelists, is only one question, not a follow-up, and ends in a question mark. So please raise your hand electronically. And just before we go, while people are thinking of their questions and raising their hand, do any of the panelists have a comment on any of the others or want to expand on that? It's a pretty dire description of where we are. Nancy, it looks like you might want to say something. Yep.
I would just pick up where Matt left off, partly because we have people on this call who are really leaning into that local news challenge. And the encouraging thing is there's a lot of really creative thinking going on and experimentation, entrepreneurship around that local news opportunity, including, when I was fascinated by talking to a big journalism school dean in the Midwest, is who are the trusted messengers? If journalists, unfortunately, and politicians are not trusted messengers, who are? And they're experimenting with using things like extension programs, which are in communities all over the country, have been working with communities for years, to be a vehicle for maybe delivering other important local information. There's all kinds of experimenting going on, and in a very democratized way. And before we say that everything about the internet was bad and everything about what has happened in the 21st century is bad, media is way more democratic, and the ability for diverse voices to be heard is greater than any time in human history. And so the opportunity here is also enormous. And I take your point, Sarah, that we should not be seeding despair at just the moment when the same tools that we are concerned about their implications may also be the tools that allow for a golden age of storytelling and of reweaving of the civic fabric.
Great. Tom, Joan, Matt, want to add
Yeah, I'd
anything?
like to jump
Yep.
in. One of the things that this conversation is provoking in me is to think about, I'm like a nerd, right? Like, I love technology. I was the kid taking apart the VCR to see what it looked like, right? And for all of and if you've taken my class, this, like, I beat up on the companies, but the technology to me is still awesome. Right. And that allure, that coolness is actually the thing that's getting in the way of us thinking about the more heady design questions about what are the guardrails now, right? Like, I'm sure it was awesome the first time someone built a plane and flew it, but it crashed, right? Like, that was awesome. But now we're like essentially flying, large jets full of hundreds and thousands and millions of people, and we've got no TSA, we've got no airport, we've got no way to land safely. And so we actually have to build an industry in a way that is, it has consumer protections. It is not sloughing off all of the, what you might call market externalities. I know like 4 economists are going to perk up when I say that. But, if you're sloughing them off and you're making journalists pay disinfo beat reporters, and you're making public health officials deal with medical misinformation at scale, I'm not talking about someone's wrong on the internet. I'm talking about millions of people receiving the wrong information all at the same time. Right. And I was actually kind of impassioned by Professor Baum's plea for hyperlocal news, because I know that the absence of that presents an opportunity for disinformers to fill the void and displace timely, local, relevant, and accurate information with, let's just call it, garbage. But one thing I want us to understand right in this moment is that the internet that it's designed right now in terms of platforms, that's not the internet. Those are things built on top of the internet. Like, if you think about your old Sega or Nintendo systems and you had to plug the cartridge in, that's what Facebook is it's a cartridge in a way, or it's a cassette tape, or whatever metaphor you want to hold. It doesn't actually predict the entire vision of what the internet could be. We're kind of stuck in this vision because we think the technology is cool, and frankly, it's become too big to legislate. And so but I want you to understand that it doesn't make that determinant of where we can go, right? It just means that we have an industry that is completely out of control. And, governments, not just the US, but other governments are probably going to sort it out. And our opportunity, I think, as people who care deeply about public service is to introduce and fight for digital public infrastructures that do that hyper local networking at a very low cost to, local reporting or other kinds of information sourcing. I'll stop on the jam there, but I'll tell you, I got ideas.
Okay, that's
Can
a
I-
lot to talk. Sure, and then I wanted to go to the audience.
Yeah, let me jump in quickly. So when I was listening to Matt, I was thinking of Madison's Federalist 10 and his arguments about the superiority of kind of moving it up toward the top versus going toward the bottom in terms of powerful interests and the like. Why would we think on the local level as we go hyper-local that so much of this blue-red stuff that is geographically based won't invade the local sphere, maybe more slowly, but won't become kind of part and parcel of what happens in these hyper-local news environments. We're certainly seeing it in terms of the playing around with election rules and the like. So it's there. And so a question for me is kind of why we would expect that somehow this particular sphere is somehow immune to those same influences that we're seeing elsewhere.
Can I offer a response to that?
Very quickly, and then we want to talk about it. I just want to get to some of the questions and then we'll come back to our panelists.
I mean, I think the answer is that to some extent, there's nothing you can do to prevent the same sort of polarization from infecting any context, whatever it is. But an awful lot of what more local and hyperlocal news cover are not the most polarizing issues. And the question that I was focusing on was restoring confidence in democratic institutions. Focusing on the kinds of community issues that aren't necessarily as inherently polarized, I think is an opportunity to rebuild some trust. To the extent that partisan entrepreneurs very quickly game it and force those entities to be just like the national media, then it would fail. But I'm just not sure that that's necessarily the case. But I don't disagree with you, in the big picture sense. For sure, that can happen.
All right, we've got a question from Dixon Osborne.
Great, thank you very much. Should Congress revive the fairness doctrine and have it extend beyond just the networks to social media and to cable?
Do you have a person you're addressing it to, or
panelists who'd like to address it?
I don't know. Tom, maybe you start with that.
I think it would be a real leap for the FCC to extend the fairness doctrine into these other kind of outlets. The justification for it was the scarcity of broadcasting licenses. Therefore, you could regulate what broadcasters do. That was the backdrop to the fairness doctrine. And at the time it was revoked, the argument was that the scarcity principle wasn't such a big problem anymore because of the growth in cable and the FM radio coming online, lots more outlets and the like. I'd love to see it reinstated and broadened, but I think that genie's out of the bottle. I'm just not sure how you would do it and have it pass muster with the courts and the like.
Okay, Alice Zhang.
Sure. Thank you very much for hosting the session and sharing our insights. So often, extreme ideas and people can dominate news coverages. There are more negative news than positive ones. So I think it is the responsibility of all Americans, companies, individuals, and media to promote the principles and values that America is founded upon. And so given the power of media, how do you think that media can be a better promoter of those principles and values, as well as bridging the political and regional divide in America? I think earlier, I believe Matthew mentioned building trust. How do we do that? How does the media set up a good example? Thank you.
Nancy, you want to start on this one?
I will confess that there's a strong journalistic allergy to positive news, to good news stories. And some of that is born out of a sense of mission, that the job of journalists is to shine lights in dark corners and expose corruption and things that are going wrong. And the problem with that, as you're suggesting, Alice, is that it can leave people with the impression that everything's going wrong. If crusading journalists spend their time covering government corruption or incompetence, it can leave the impression the government is generally corrupt and incompetent. And I think that inclination has, while again born of a conviction that the purpose of journalism in a democracy is to hold the powerful to account, can have a distorting effect in paying too little attention to solutions that are working and might be scalable and what you think of as being good news. And this is actually something that journalists are talking about, and there are initiatives like the Solutions Journalism Network that are trying to encourage newsrooms to think differently about writing about solutions to problems, which I think would have the effect of also rebuilding trust. If you are consuming information that shows that some city somewhere, some new government effort around early childhood education has had demonstrably powerful positive effects, that can act as a bit of a vaccine against the continuous negative news that suggests that government is not working. So I think some of the rebuilding of trust just is incumbent on journalists to be as willing to look for what's working as what's not, and to recognize the incredible power in sharing solutions that other communities might adopt for themselves.
Matt, did you have anybody, Matt, Tom, Joan, want to add to that?
I don't have that much to add to that, except, you know, a caution, I guess, that I think the media becomes kind of a sledgehammer that polarized groups, different stripes, use to pound each other with. We have a cultural, we have basically a lot of contestation over what our cultural norms and values are or should be, and I think it's hard to expect the media to teach people the proper norms and values when out in the culture, in the society, we're having a bitter argument about what those should be. So I take everything that Nancy said, but I just would my caveat is that I think you can't expect the media to fix that. I mean, we have to fix that as a society before, the media can communicate those sorts of messages. And that's leaving aside that, Nancy sort of led with this sort of allergy to preaching good news. What they teach you in journalism schools is not to make normative judgments, that stick to the facts and the objective truth. And so it would require, revising the culture, at least in the institutional media, obviously not the partisan media. So that's another hurdle that would have to be surmounted to try and have the media play that kind of role.
Okay. Tom, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think there's a big problem with the way that incentives are aligned, even at the local level. As the advertising revenue to some degree has been kind of disappearing. Local television news has never been all that strong. And in many places, it's really kind of crime stories, fire stories, and the like. I mean, they're chasing the ratings. If there's a kind of a growth industry at the local level, it's Sinclair. The incentive that they're pursuing is not that of informing the public, but very much of mobilizing the public around a particular ideology. So I really am a firm believer in the fact that we need to strengthen local media, but my problem is that when I look at the incentives that are driving so much of what's happening, not only at the national level, but at the local level, they're really misaligned with what we'd like to see the media doing.
Okay, another next question from Richard Parker.
I don't feel as distressed about the stress that the system is going through, and I would like someone on the panel to take that up. We're in a situation where 20 years ago, it looked to many scholars like voters were vanishing. There'd been a long, steady decline in voting from the 60s right up to the 90s. We've now had record turnout in this last election. And if one measure of democracy is the commitment of people to vote, boy, we're knocking it out of the park. This is the highest level of voting as a percentage of voting eligible population that we've had in a century. So I think what we want to think about is the relationship of media to democracy and its role in facilitating or strengthening the democratic combat that occurs when you engage issues as large as economic, racial, and gender inequality, which is what we're doing now. I don't think that we can hope for a peaceful period while we engage those issues. Any of the panelists?
Let's take that.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here, flex a little of my sociology brain. You know, you don't go through a pandemic and, you know, just kind of come out the other side having like reset and resolved the troubles in the world. And so I think that we are in a broad inflection point, but it was very suspicious to me that we had such high voter turnout. I mean, that was weird, unpredictable, perhaps a result of all of the voting efforts and information that, like, you know, were just kind of thrust into the world. That even the controversy around, you know, mail-in ballots and whatnot, that made everybody aware that you could vote by mail. And it seemed to actually backfire in some ways for some folks that maybe chose to opt out entirely. And so as I'm thinking about these questions, like I'm with you that there's some things that happened over the last several months that have been totally confounding sociologically, do not fit patterns that we have known about, are not necessarily the results of technology behaving in a certain way, but actually have a lot to do with the fact that, you know, we're in an economic emergency, we're in a public health emergency. Information can't solve all the things. People are screaming for community. They want to be back in connection with one another. And so I think in the long and broad strokes, we are going through a historical turning. Our institutions are not going to be the same. And there is a moment, and I think a battle actually, for those rebuilding blocks, right? Like literally the anchors on which we're going to lay the foundation and hold the next 20, 30, 40 years together. And so as we think about the role that technology plays in shaping our politics, I just, you know, want people to be reminded that this is a society-wide problem that requires a whole of society approach to thinking through all the individual pieces that make for a good, healthy, and truly democratic society. And then we also have to think about what is the basis on which we will build new forms of trust, right? Let's not sit in the you know, the old stereotypes about how we think institutions and local news and all of these things should run, and imagine something different and possibly better, but also not controlled by billionaires that are going to make sure that it, you know, always is tilted in their favor, right? I mean, even at the poker table, the dealer's not allowed to play. And so, you know, there's some ways in which I think we have to now think through the next iteration of our media, our environment, our politics, and our technology. But I still remain rather hopeful because of these anomalies that are not explainable in the immediacy.
Thanks, Joan. We have a question from Raleigh Brown.
Yes, hi. So based on previous comments, it might be for Professor Baum or Dr. Donovan, but happy to hear from anyone. So obviously one of the sort of underlying tenets of the First Amendment is that the truth will always out, no matter what's going on at the crazy wings. There will be some sort of center, you know, rational thinking people will identify the actual truth. And obviously that's failed and needs fixing at this point. And in the wake of January 6th, it seems like a lot of people are turning increasingly to imposed policy solutions, you know, really celebrating that certain social media platforms have stepped up to declare certain types of speech unacceptable. But it seems to me in a way that some sort of organic shift actually rather than a top-down imposed system of fixing this problem. A bottom-up amelioration of the problem would really prove, would itself be, you know, a great result for the Build Back Better campaign, to prove that the American people are capable of coalescing around a truth, and can prove that we've still got it, that the First Amendment still works without chipping away here and there, imposing restrictions on certain types of speech. So can I ask you about the first feasibility of imposed solutions versus an organic solution, you know, changing popular sentiment, and the desirability of one versus the other, which would be more effective, whether, as I said, an organic solution is in and of itself, you know, a great success for the Biden administration.
Matt, do you want to start on that?
Sure. I'm trying to think how I want to answer this. I mean, I think if we take a step back, you know, the pretty clear answer to me is that, you know, there's room for both top-down and bottom-up approaches, and both are necessary. But I want to caveat this by saying, you know, there's a reason, the top that we're talking about, I guess, is the public sector, the government. I mean, the reason that, you know, societies have governments is because there are big problems that at the individual level we can't address, but when we collectively pool our resources, we have a better shot at addressing it. And it's sort of a, at least to me, a kind of libertarian quirk of American culture that we've identified, we've sort of associated this with oppression and sort of this top-down imposition. I mean, the reality is that there are things like building interstate highways that individually we can't do from the bottom up. You know, there's just no way collectively to do it. And I think arguably to a significant extent, figuring out the, you know, the cultural dilemmas we face, you know, certainly, you know, there are breakthroughs periodically from the grassroots, really powerful ones, and those need to be nurtured. And so, you know, we need to have a dialogue between, if you want to call it the bottom and the top, all the time, so that you're not drowning one or the other out. But I don't think we can solve these really big problems purely organically. I think that's not realistic. I think it had, you know, if it were, we wouldn't need a government, and human beings didn't do so well before there were governments. So, so I think it really takes an interplay.
Let me just add one thing here, which is the situation that we're in right now. We should all very closely follow the antitrust, you know, investigations and hearings and whatnot around the collusion between Facebook and Google. And here's why. We're seeing a lot of price fixing, scams, hoaxes, all kinds of things that in other forms of communication you wouldn't be allowed to do. Like, I couldn't go to the Boston Globe, put an ad in that says, send me, you know, $50 and I'll send you a bunch of masks, and then take your money, and there's no one behind the ad, right? Boston Globe does due diligence. It takes your information when it takes your money. But with online advertising, you can do that all day, every day. And what we saw, I wrote about this in MIT Tech Review, is, you know, hospitals were forced to use Eventbrite to book appointments for the vaccine. And so scammers just rushed in and made their own Eventbrite pages and said, well, for $25, you can reserve your place in line to get the vaccine. And so people just handed over their money and then started showing up to these vaccine sites. And this is a supply chain attack. And there was no appointment for them because you didn't actually have to pay for the vaccine. And so what we need is consumer protections in a way that makes more of the commerce online accountable. And that's a different question than asking about your right to free speech. When anything that is monetized online, we need to have a way to capture those transactions and understand those exchanges. Otherwise, we get caught up in all kinds of scams and hoaxes and grifts, and disinformation thrives in environments like that.
Tom or Nancy, do you have a comment on whether the First Amendment still is viable?
Well, I'm so interested to know what Miles Rappaport wants to know, and I know that we're late on time, so.
Well, we've got till 5:30. We're doing,
Okay.
yeah, we're till 5:30. So anything to say on the First Amendment?
there are a lot of people probably, including on this call, who are more deeply into the tensions around the First Amendment and its limitations than I. So all I will say is that it's been a strange experience to go from having been a pretty adamant First Amendment defender, which most journalists are, to being much more mindful about the damage that speech can do when harassment is so much easier, when the accountability for speech is so much less. And so I have become increasingly convinced that we are going to need to be much more creative and sophisticated in the kinds of limitations around speech. But whether that is imposed from on high, I think a certain amount of that is going to be necessary. I don't have total faith that this is going to happen organically. But as I say, there are other people on this call who have given this a huge amount of thought. So.
Okay, well, let's go to Miles. Miles Rappaport.
All right, thank you. So I remember, a kind of set of worried conversations that were about the last technological breakthrough, which was television, which was referred to as a vast wasteland. And, we were despairing of everything that was horrifyingly happening to the children. And what happened then, it seems to me, were two different things that were, antidotes of a kind. One was to step in and for government to step in and do real regulation, like the Fairness Doctrine. And it seems to me that kind of wading in here and grappling with the First Amendment issues, as well as the commercial issues that Joan was just talking about, makes sense. The other thing was that a public option was created in the form of PBS that didn't throttle the private networks, but competed with them. And I think that has done a pretty good job of elevating, that genre. So the question is there some version of that, a public option in the platform world that can compete with the ones that are controlled by the billionaires and have the democratic accountability of government?
So when I think about what the internet has brought us, I think about it in two ways. TV is a little different because it's sort of a one-to-many, and we're dealing with a many-to-many model. But we don't start there. Actually, if you look back at who was using Facebook in 2010 or Twitter in 2010, it's not news organizations. One of our fellows, Jennifer Preston's on the call, is like the person who brought social media to the New York Times, right? And so in many ways, we're very early in our understanding about how broadcast organizations are going to utilize this many-to-many model. And so we have to think through then, what are the implications of someone having an audience online of 50 people or 5 million people, right? And one of the things that January 6th showed us is that when you have command and control of 88 million people's attention during a public event that involves violence, you can tell them to go for it, or you can tell them to walk away. And a lot of people are going to listen, especially ones that are in the midst of that catastrophe. And so when I think about this, I actually think about it as a problem of amplification rather than one of speech. I think about social media as like a boombox, and not a lot of people know the history of the boombox and how the Walkman won, right? How the cassette player, the Discman won. But the boombox was considered this intruder in communities and at the beach and on the block, and there were all these rules starting to pop up about how are we going to not let people's music bother us when we're in Tompkins Square Park. And so if we think about this with the way in which things like the Discman or the Walkman, I know that again only a few of us remember what it was like to put the headphones on. It won not just because it was a personalized technology, but because it didn't interfere in public space. It didn't bring up the same concerns about the connectivity between people and the intrusions that other people have felt. The other metaphor I use to think about this is especially related to misinformation at scale is it's like secondhand smoke. Well, everybody's got a right to smoke, and that's fine. And that's fine with me. But the laws we get about secondhand smoke are about public space. And they're about the ways in which we're affected by other people's behavior. And in particular, we don't get laws on secondhand smoke until we get epidemiology saying it's a problem, insurance companies saying it's a problem, HVAC folks talking, mega corporations into retrofitting their buildings so that people can smoke indoors, and business owners saying, well, that's terrible. That's a big expense. I'll just ban smoking, right? And so we're actually in the midst of that shift into thinking about misinformation as secondhand smoke, into understanding social media as like a quasi-public space that needs some rules. And so I think you're right to say that there's things to look at in terms of TV and radio that can help us. But what we're dealing with is new. The nascent historian in me can say that with some certainty. Caveats,
I think, Miles, the place where I see the parallel to the creation of public television, again, is that a lot of the energy, not all of it, I mean, there are a lot of people who are looking for sustainable business models for local news and national news, but there's also an awful lot of work being done around philanthropy, around nonprofits, around social impact investing, around reframing. I mean, remember, it started out that, journalism was a business. It was a profit-making, privately owned business. And I think one of the lessons that people have been taking away from what we've witnessed in these recent months and years is that it also has to be a public good. And if its public purpose is not being performed, then the public needs to reassess how that purpose will be performed. And so you're going to see, I think, a lot of debate, and we're seeing it in this Congress, about what are the various bills moving through having to do with support for local news, millions of proposals around, taxing the platforms or giving people tax credits to subscribe to a newspaper, all sorts of different ways to encourage different financial models, whether philanthropic or publicly supported, government supported, in order to at least prevent the news deserts from broadening and having those spaces be filled with reliable, independent sources of information. That opens up tremendous challenges as well that I think we are going to have to be doing a lot of research into. How you define who counts as a news organization, who should be eligible for tax deductible donations, for public funding. There's still a lot of work to be done to make that work. Joan talked about Jennifer Preston's work at Knight. Knight has been instrumental, and other foundations as well, but especially Knight, around helping people experiment. And projects like Report for America, which, modeled after Teach for America, let's actually enlist young people in a spirit of service to join newsrooms and bolster their news gathering capacity. Tom, you could talk about the research you're doing now on public radio's role here. I think that the rethinking about public support, public money support, and nonprofit support for this essential function of people being informed about the matters that affect their community, affect their state, affect their country, whose responsible that is, and how we should pay for it, is undergoing a radical transformation right now.
Great, thank you.
Tom, do you want to add to that?
I can step in briefly. So I think it's important when we think about alternatives that we kind of not turn our back on what's out there, because brand name is important and infrastructure is important. We have a really massive local public radio system in the US, but it's not starving for money, but it certainly is not flush with money. And if you think about an entity that really does try to kind of serve the public sphere and tries to be a community builder, it's kind of hard to think of something much better than public radio. But The challenge there is how do you significantly raise revenues to make public radio a larger player, and particularly in those news deserts where the local newspaper is either gone or going, and there's really not a suitable placement that has kind of the community's trust. And when you look at the trust levels, public radio is about as high up on that ladder as there is. So I think there's some real opportunity around local public radio, but it would take a lot more funding. And as those of you that have looked at it, that Congress has been walking away from public broadcasting. It's been diminishing the appropriation, and it's now a fairly small. If they depended on Congress to operate, they'd have gone out of business by now.
Okay, we have a question in the chat, which I will read unless the questioner wants to unmute herself. And the question is, most of the speakers seem to be hinting at a need for regulation of social media that make money by conveying misinformation. What specific regulations would they like to see that would not run into conflict with the First Amendment? Sounds like Joan is the one to start on this one.
I mean, it's all day, every day in my house. I actually have a whiteboard over here of things that I've been jamming on. I want to assure you that what things that are going to happen to Section 230 are going to restructure our online communication, but they're probably not going to affect you personally in the way you might be worried about. And I say that only to say that you are already limited in different ways that you have no idea how these algorithms work. You have no idea how they self-select, so that if you type in on Facebook things like congratulations, that post will be shown to pretty much everyone in your network. Whereas if you type in things like I'm really sad today, that's not going to be shown to anyone. And so there's all these different ways in which we need to increase transparency around the distribution of information and how money is made on it. Another thing you might not know is that you're only allowed to have 5,000 friends on Facebook, and then you become what's known as a public figure, and your friends list actually turns into a page, and you have no control over that. And so I want you to think about the problem as one of scale. I wrote about this for Harvard Business Review, where we are now in this moment where we have to understand that things that can happen in proportion of millions of people are different from things that happen in proportion of even 10,000 people. And we've known this for a long time related to radio and how much wattage a tower can have and how many people it can reach. But we have to think about the profitability of misinformation as a business plan, frankly, and as a political strategy. And when we think about it that way, it's different than the worries that I too have about misinformation. And I give you one idea to think on, right? I'm not telling you got to believe me. The data's out there. I'm collecting it. And we will report on this, but we wrote a little piece to the UN. They had an open call about, well, why should we care about free expression and disinformation anyway? And we make the argument that the more volume we have of misinformation at scale, that is misinformation that's reaching tens of thousands of people at a time, is displacing now your ability to reach each other. And that has to do, in the social dilemma, they blame it on the attention economy. But I think that gives you too much control over what you think is happening. We're actually in an algorithmic economy, which is to say that the machines and the design of the machines and the inputs and outputs are determined elsewhere. And for the most part, you select in some things, but the machine and the algorithm, but because it's black box, there's a beautiful book on this by Sophia Noble called Algorithms of Oppression, another great book by Frank Pasquale called The Black Box Society. Because we don't know what's happening and we don't know how our speech is being distributed and in what proportions and to who, we don't have a very good idea about how much of our truly free expression it's displacing, especially the monetized stuff. You can imagine when you add an advertisement inside someone's newsfeed, it's like putting a billboard in it, like right next to their window, right? And so it actually displaces other things you might see. And when that advertising is disinformation, sometimes it's advertising that is specifically paid into the company. But then there's other stuff called SpawnCon. I'll close on this one point because not a lot of people understood what happened during the primaries. Mr. Bloomberg paid a bunch of influencers on Instagram to post about him. People that are very well known for memes and hilarious stuff. And he basically paid them to say, Bloomberg is paying me to tell you he's cool. And he was, but this sponsored content is a political ad in the midst of your feed, and you are following this other account who's not necessarily disclosing to you that they're making fun of Bloomberg because there's a paycheck involved. And we see that all over the net now. And so we have to care about how this stuff all interlocks and comes together so that we don't tip the battlefield over to the opponents here who are going to use every technology at their disposal to make sure that you see what they want you to see.
Can I make a quick comment?
Yep.
So I wanted to comment that this regulating misinformation is incredibly difficult, in part because the vast majority of it isn't, strictly speaking, classic, what we would call fake news, factually false, demonstrably the opposite of truth. The vast majority of what we would recognize as misinformation is, strictly speaking, true but out of context or exaggerated, and the lines are very blurry. And that's really a big part of the reason why, until very recently, the solution was anything goes. We can't really figure out where to draw that line. So we're just not going to draw any lines. After January 6th, Twitter took President Trump offline because of the consequences of what he said, but it did, his rhetoric didn't become more or less truthful on January 6th. It just that it had consequences that were, that they weren't acceptable to them. So I think, any notion of regulating misinformation is going to run into this problem of where exactly you draw the line and what constitutes acceptable or unacceptable, if you don't want to think of misinformation versus information. And it was very easy to imagine us overshooting in the opposite direction, as public policy is wanting to do, to kind of ping back and forth between extremes. I'll stop there.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to thank our 4 panelists, Joan Donovan, Matt Baum, Tom Patterson, Nancy Gibbs, for incredibly insightful, lots of issues to think about and lots of areas to try to focus on to make things a little bit better. Please join us. Remember, so you can unmute yourself if you want to thank our panelists, and please remember to join us on April 8th for our next Dean's discussion on restoring health and economic growth in developing countries. And thank you all for coming. And thank you to our panelists very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Thank you all for joining us.